Weekly Livestock Market Update. I'm Brownfield News Anchor reporter Megan Grebner. With us is University of Missouri Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
All right, we've got a lot to talk about this week. There's Hogs and Pigs report. We've got to get into some market and what's been going on through Thursday night. I will give the disclaimer that we are taping Thursday evening, so all of the market activity that we're discussing happened through the close of business on Thursday. So let's start first and talk a little bit about what happened this week in the markets.
Yeah, I think if we start on the hog side first, Megan, cash hog prices, we're going to call them down $3 through Thursday of this week. So it's been another tougher week for hog prices. When we look at the pork cutout value, it's also down about $2.50 for the week. We're now talking about a pork cutout value that was below year-ago levels by roughly 5% with what we got out this week. Bellies, again, were down $6 for the week, and that puts them 14% below a year-ago level. So weakness occurring both in terms of that pork cutout value as well as the cash hog prices. On the cattle side of the equation, it's a little early yet this week to get much of a test in terms of fed cattle prices, but we'll call them right now at least steady for what we've seen so far this week. When you look at the feeder cattle side, heavyweight cattle, we're going to call those up slightly, 1 to 5 higher for the week, while lightweight cattle have tended to be slightly lower for the week. The choice beef cutout value was actually higher for the week, and I think when you look at what's happened this week in cattle markets with the bearish cattle on feed report last Friday, the higher choice cutout value certainly helped stabilize cattle prices as we've gone through the week. They were up about $3.60 for the week, and really much of that strength came in terms of higher rib prices.
Scott, as we talk a little bit about that cattle on feed report, Monday really took on the cattle side of things. The market took it on the chin. We've been able to rebound a little bit since then. How important does that choice beef cutout role? You mentioned that it's kind of helped to temper some of those losses this week, but how important is that role when we look at profits and losses for livestock?
Yeah, so I think it's really been important in terms of what that demand side's done. This is probably the story that you and I have been on for several weeks in a row, but it just reminds us that you get a more negative from the supply side report with cattle on feed with placements above what we would have thought. We started the week with that weakness, but then that demand side's continued to be fairly strong, and when you can end up with a choice beef cutout value that's higher for the week, it tends to provide some support to cash cattle prices, both fed cattle as well as feeder cattle prices. So it is really important that demand side keep trucking along, and it tells me there's still fairly strong demand occurring for beef in terms of what we see today, and I think that's both increases in demand for domestic as well as stronger international demand for U.S. beef as well.
The other story that we've been talking so much about lately, Scott, is the abundance of meat supply. That continues. And as we switch gears and take a look outside of the beef and pork market, the chicken side of things really is showing that it's giving pork and beef a run for its money here.
Yeah, so anytime when you talk about feed prices that have been very attractive, we tend to turn up a lot of these meat sectors. And just as I've been looking at the data so far on chicken production for the year, I look the first 21 weeks of 2017, we're only up 0.5% relative to a year ago. That started to expand. So when you look at the next 14 weeks after the first 21, we were up about 1.3% over that 14-week period. But when you look at the last 3 weeks of data that we have, up 5.2% relative to a year ago level, it tells me the chicken side of this equation started to turn up as well. And we keep putting more supplies of meat, of beef, pork, and chicken, all three on the market. You do have to be worried about what the drag on prices might be.
Scott, as we look at that, how does that come into play? What do we have to watch as beef and pork producers when we see this competition? Last week we talked about meatless meat competition. Is the competition good for us, or do we need to figure out a way that everybody maybe gets a piece of the pie?
Well, more meat supplies just means that all else equal, that meat bundle probably has to move down to move all the meats. I keep reminding everyone that for me, this is a real focus on what does the consumer really want? And if you take beef or pork, either one, what exactly is that attribute in beef and pork that make consumers go, I want more beef or more pork on the plate? And that's what we really need to focus on when we're putting these kinds of larger supplies in front of consumers. Meeting what they really want sure gives us a chance to get prices to be higher than they otherwise would have been. And that certainly needs to be the focus of these industries when you recognize just the abundant supplies of meat that we have today.
And that's not wavering on the pork side of things either, Scott. Hogs and Pigs report came out today. The latest report really kind of shows that expansion in the industry is continuing. So let's get into some of those numbers, and then we're going to talk a little risk management for hog producers.
Yes, so it's interesting Hogs and Pigs report. I'll say many of the numbers came in pretty in line with what we would have thought pre-report. If we look at all hogs and pigs, record high for September at about 73.5 million head of hogs and pigs. Again, very close to what we would have thought pre-report. If you look at the breeding inventory number, so sows 1.2% higher, that was right in line with the average pre-report estimate. So for many things, I think we're in pretty good shape. However, when you start looking at the market hog inventory by weight group, a couple things to me stuck out of today's report. Number one, those hogs weighing 180 pounds plus, USDA said those were up 3.9%. That was relative to a pre-report estimate that was 2.6% higher. And even the 120 to 179 weight category, USDA called up 3.9%. Pre-report would have had them up 2.9. So both those numbers suggesting got a little bit of more heavier weight hogs in inventory right now. All else equal probably means we slaughter a few more hogs as we go through the next several weeks. The other thing I see in the Hogs and Pigs report that we can talk about a little bit is just, where are sows being located? Where are we seeing growth? Where are we seeing reductions? When we look at this September report relative to a year ago, Missouri actually leads the way, up about 45,000 head in terms of sow inventory, while we can look at the other end of the spectrum and we have Minnesota that's down 50,000 head. So we're starting to see some movements in terms of where those sows are located. One can look at the Michigan data, for example, where we have sows up 15,000 head, and perhaps some of these new plants coming on board are in fact starting to give us some places where we are growing sow inventories.
Were we a little surprised to see some of those numbers as it comes to sow inventory? You saw a little bit of an increase in Michigan, but you saw a big increase in Missouri and a big decline relative to a year ago in Minnesota.
Yeah, so Megan, it seems to me that you look in the industry and folks are beginning to realize that perhaps ending up with sows in a bedroom community, if you will, away from where we produce a lot of hogs for slaughter, might be a good disease strategy. And so I think we are seeing that movement of let's get sows away a little bit from where we're feeding them the majority of the hogs. And I think that shows up in some of the data that we're looking at, on top of maybe perhaps some sows being moved closer to where those new plants are coming on board.
Let's get into talking a little bit about risk management for hog producers. We know that seasonally we're seeing the largest runs of hogs, and we're setting record production day after day. 460,000 on Tuesday this week, 460,000 on Wednesday this week. We know there's a lot of hogs. How do we manage some of that downside risk?
Yeah, well, I guess really a couple things come at me. Number one, there were some great opportunities a few months ago to lay off a lot of risk in pork markets. So I hope a lot of producers at this point laid off a lot of that fourth quarter risk, because I think as we look forward, it's going to be hard to get much of a bump in terms of futures markets. But the second part of that story for me is make sure, if we get any kind of little rally in hogs, don't be unrealistic about where these prices are going, given the large slaughter numbers that we're going to have to deal with here till the end of the year at a minimum. And frankly, we're going to continue that into 2018. Even though we got more shackle space than we would have had a year ago at this time, we do have to deal with that pork as well. And so I think all those things tend to, give us what could be lower prices. So understanding what's realistic in terms of price expectations, if you need to do some price risk management, is important. The flip side of this, corn has been cheaper. Make certain that you don't end up in a situation where not only do we have low hog prices, but for some reason corn prices start to move higher and you aren't locked in on the input side. I don't see a lot of pressure for higher corn prices, but it won't be long before we start looking at South America and see what happens there in terms of a corn crop that I think is important.
Scott, as we wind things down this week, we've talked a lot about demand, domestic, both international and domestic demand. How is the domestic demand playing a role here in the U.S. as we look at some of those higher quality cuts, specifically on the beef side of things?
Yeah, so certified Angus beef this week remind us that for the 11th consecutive year, they've hit a record in terms of the amount of CAB product they've sold. I think about 1.13 billion pounds of CAB product that was sold in their 2017 year. It just reminds me that demand for higher quality beef certainly has been strong as we've gone through 2017, and you see the kinds of numbers they're able to generate. It again will remind me on the cattle side, maybe that's a price risk management tool. If consumers demand those higher quality beef cuts more than lower quality, if I can create animals that grade higher, I might get a higher price, all else equal. It is important just to see that how strong that demand's been, and that's back to my saying, we need to put in front of consumers what they want. It seems to me that demand for higher quality beef is one area we could certainly be focused on. You look on top and you're starting to see a few companies that are also, reporting some better profitability. I believe Cargill this week gave us some pretty good news on their bottom line side, and they certainly look at the demand for beef as being responsible for a portion of what they're calling in terms of better profitability.
And we'll be able to talk a little bit more about the international side for demand as we look ahead next week. Restaurant Performance Index for the domestic side, but monthly trade data comes out next week. What are some of the things maybe we're looking for in that report?
Yeah, so for sure, so I go on the beef side, both sides. We've seen some pretty good imports coming primarily from Oceania, I guess at this point. I want to see where that heads as we get numbers next week, as well as just what's the strength in some of these traditional growing markets for us. What's happened in Mexico, Japan, etc. We need to continue to have good news in terms of what we're pushing out on the beef side, and as well as on the pork side. We're going to have pretty large supplies of pork to deal with here for the remainder of the year. The larger proportion of those increased supplies we can push to other countries, that's going to be really important.
Scott, have a great weekend. We'll talk to you next Friday and be able to touch on a little bit too how the market digested today's Hogs and Pigs report.
Very good, Megan.
If you have questions or comments, you can visit our website, brownfieldagnews.com. Click subscribe. You can submit your questions and comments there as well. And for market updates twice daily, make sure to check out John Perkins' Market Minute. Have a great weekend. I'm Megan Grebner on Brownfield.